Great. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome from around the world, and thank you for joining us during Global Intergenerational Week. We are thrilled to be hosting this webinar looking at global perspectives from practice, policy, and research. My name is Charlotte Miller, and I'm joined here today with Emily Abbott, speaking as the co-founders of Intergenerational England, the UK's national body, which focuses on embedding intergenerational approaches across policy systems and place. At the moment, most of our systems across health, housing, education, communities are designed around age groups operating separately. But as we all know, that's not how people live. But at the same time, we're seeing a major demographic shift. More generations are living alongside each other than ever before, but our systems haven't kept pace. The impact is becoming clear. There is rising loneliness, increasing pressure on services, and growing challenges around social cohesion. What is encouraging is that the evidence base is now moving quickly. Across different countries and sectors, we're starting to see what works and also what needs to change. So today is about bringing those perspectives together and focusing on what this means for how we design our systems going forward. We're thrilled to be joined by an excellent group of speakers spanning global health, policy, economic, social cohesion, public space, and community practice, including colleagues from the World Health Organization, British Future, the International Longevity Centre, leading academic and frontline organisations, including the launch of Intergenerational England's new report, Past, Present and Future Generations, which explores international perspectives on intergenerational practice and policy. Each speaker today will be sharing a short 10-minute contribution, and then we're going to open up for discussion towards the end in our panel discussion around about kind of 1:10, 1:15. Please do add your questions into the Q&A, and we hope we can get to them all. So on to our first two speakers. Our first speakers today bring a global public health lens to this conversation. We're thrilled to welcome Xin-Yi Li, who is a consultant with the Life Course team at the World Health Organization's Department of Sexual, Reproductive, Maternal, Child, Adolescent Health and Aging. With a background in public health and over a decade of experience in project implementation, particularly in resource-limited settings, she leads project management efforts that help WHO's Life Course network deliver scientific and policy outputs relevant for countries. Dr. Shandi Maria Jacob is a public health researcher with a background in clinical medicine. She supports the World Health Organization on life course approaches to health and well-being, and also serves as the Senior Health Systems Research Advisor at the World Obesity Federation. Her work focuses on reducing inequalities in healthy development and healthy aging across key life stages. So we welcome you both here today, and thank you very much for kickstarting this webinar off. Thank you. Over to you both.
Thank you, Charlotte. And thank you for Intergenerational England for the invitation and for the opportunity to present on behalf of the WHO Life Course team. My name is Xin-Yi Li. I will start off this presentation with a brief overview of the Life Course program of work that sits within our department. It's a very long name, but we also abbreviate it as the Life Course Health and Research Department. The program of work is under the leadership of Dr. Ritu Sadana as the principal investigator. And on our team, in addition to Dr. Chani Jacob, we also have Dr. Vanessa DeRubis, who both of them are co-research coordinators. So the WHO's Life Course program brings together a network of over 250 experts and researchers spanning individual life stages. This is both within WHO headquarters and across 6 regional offices. It also includes experts and researchers from national institutes, civil society, and more than 25 life course research centers around the globe. We are halfway through a 5-year phase one with the aim of generating evidence and providing guidance on how countries can implement a life course approach in practice. Next slide, please. So the starting point for what we are presenting today is the WHO framework to implement a life course approach in practice, which was published in July 2025. This framework defines what a life course approach actually means. So a good start to life, optimal development of infants, children, adolescents, and youth, adult health and well-being, and healthy aging, inclusive of older people, and also a dignified death at any age. Critically, the framework is not just a conceptual document. It draws on global evidence and real implementation examples, several of which you will see throughout the presentation, on how countries can reorient health systems to produce health and well-being at every stage of life. Next slide, please. So this slide illustrates one of the core concepts underpinning the life course approach, which is the health trajectory and how we can optimize it. The curve shows a hypothetical health trajectory of an individual. The key insight is that the trajectory is not fixed. So it can be shaped by conditions and experiences we encounter across our lives and also crucially across generations. There are 3 strategic goals depicted here. First, the optimal development in the early years, building the reserve and maintaining health throughout adolescence, youth, and adulthood, and maintaining well-being, even with declines in health in older adults. There are critical and sensitive periods along this trajectory where specific windows that interventions have disproportionately large effects. Next slide, please. In our framework, we had identified collectively a criteria, 6 criterias that puts a life course approach in practice. How do we identify these interventions as a life course approach? So first of all is to focus on a whole person. This means that we're addressing health capacities, abilities for well-being, and the broader environment together, rather than just focusing on diseases. The second is to enable early evidence-based action at every life stage. The third is to promote health equity. Fourth is to put in place appropriate evidence-based action that is impactful in the local context. So this is about translation and adaptation. And the fifth one, ensure evidence-based actions are taken together across sectors and with people of all ages. And finally, ensure that actions connect all life stages and critical as well as sensitive periods. Next slide, please. So I think most relevant to the topic today is a principle on ensuring actions are taken together, including across sectors and generations. I'll hand over now to Dr. Chani Jacob, who will give us some further examples on intergenerational activities.
Thank you, Shini. Next slide, please. So Shini has presented a bit of an overview of the conceptual thinking of the framework as such, which does, as a key principle, include intergenerational action. I'll focus a bit more on that principle itself, and then talk about a few examples and case studies that we had included in our framework, as well as some of the work that's ongoing at the moment within our program of work. For example, importantly, this approach recognizes the value of intergenerational action. For example, that may be through older people supporting younger people through caregiving, knowledge sharing, or mentoring, and younger generations supporting older women, for example, through social engagement, digital inclusion, or care. So by involving stakeholders across sectors and generations, interventions are more responsive to real needs, and it's better embedded in communities, and it's more likely to produce sustained benefits across the life course rather than isolated short-term gains within a specific life stage. A key example that we had highlighted in our report, for example, was from northern India in the state of Rajasthan by the NGO called Gravis. They have, for example, set up intergenerational learning groups of over 400 such groups to strengthen solidarity between girls, women, and older women, which supports health as well as skills and social participation across different life stages. And they also include women centered environmental action in the form of a water security program. And they have had a lot of success. If you read a little bit more specifically from about Gravis on their website, which reduces climate and care burdens that disproportionately affect women. They've also focused quite a lot on education across generations, care systems that span the life course. But most importantly, they have taken that multi-sectoral approach, which is also a place-based approach, which has integrated health, education, livelihood, and cultural factors while planning for using a life course approach. Next slide, please. So what we really mean by intergenerational action across the life course is that it brings people of different ages and generations together in a purposeful as well as mutually beneficial activity that promotes greater understanding as well as respect. So these actions and relationships then later contribute to stronger, better connected communities as well as helps with combating ageism. So in our framework, we also have some country case studies by governments that we've included. For example, in Sierra Leone, the Ministry of Health and Sanitation uses a person-centered approach to overcome siloed health services. And this integrates antenatal education along with care such as vaccinations and offering support for breastfeeding, thus improving outcomes for both mother as well as children across generations. We also have other examples from Japan, for example, which is an intergenerational community center program, which connects older women with childcare and civic roles, and also from Latin America, where there are conditional cash transfer programs supporting girls' education as well as maternal health with long-term benefits into older age. Next slide, please. So Shini did touch a bit about the person-centered approach we are taking. Conceptually, this is based on the International Classification of Functioning by the WHO rather than the ICD, which looks more at diseases. So the ICF broadly categorizes the different domains that are important to us physically into health capacities, which is used to describe an individual's health state, with the optimal capacity being the highest possible level of functioning that a person may reach. And then abilities are activities or capabilities that an individual should do or be or might want to do. So things that basically influence our well-being, such as resilience, the ability to meet basic needs, to contribute to society, to learn and grow across all life stages, and then other environmental factors that influences us as well. And these classifications are important at different levels for different life stages. So some of these, for example, sexual and reproductive capacity typically tends to be more relevant from adolescence, while cognition is important and relevant across the life course as well. Next slide, please. So in our framework, we actually also go into what we can actually do to achieve optimum capacity, but also maintain it and prevent early decline, as shown in that trajectory earlier by Shini. So for these different domains, we have listed why a certain domain is important. For example, the domain of sexual and reproductive health, what can actually be done for each of these domains, and then how this actually supports a person's well-being. So at each life stage, childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and then older age, there are specific vulnerabilities which can be tackled by interventions and have impacts for that life stage as well as the next life stage. So the arrows also emphasize that actions at one stage influence outcome at another stage. For example, maternal health, caregiving, nutrition in adulthood can shape child health, while norms, care practices, and knowledge passed on by older women, for example, can influence adolescent well being. And that has that intergenerational element as well. So, this visual sort of reinforces that women's health is not linear or age bound, for example, but it is relational and interconnected across different generations. So making these pathways explicit from WHO as well helps with policymakers making designed interventions that strengthen capacities over time and reduce that intergenerational transmission of disadvantage, for example, through nutritional or educational interventions. So in the document, we have listed and mapped quite a few WHO guidelines and other systematic reviews that exist, and some gaps that we are working on as well. For example, in the later life stages related to menopause, there's a bit of a gap related to interventions there. Next slide, please. One of the concepts that we are very keen on working on and have just started some work recently as well is on system flexibility. The idea is that as populations live longer and that fertility rates decline, countries actually face a growing pressure to adapt not just their health systems, but also education, labor, as well as social protection systems. And system flexibility is this concept that describes how these systems can evolve to be responsive to people's diverse capacities, abilities, and needs across the life course, rather than being guided solely by someone's chronological age. So it's trying to look whether there are social protection interventions out there that are going beyond age as a cutoff or criteria for social protection interventions. And we were also interested in looking at labor and education related interventions too. So particularly, we are interested in understanding if currently around capacities and abilities to better characterize people's health around the life course, are there programs that use eligibility criteria based on needs and abilities and function for people. So we are conducting a research activity to examine that criteria across all the ILO branches that are currently used to determine eligibility. And we are sharing emergent findings with a small group of experts as well, and quite keen to be involved over the year while we do some of these activities too, if people are interested. So we've listed a couple of examples, say for example, from Japan, India, and Brazil that illustrate a range of programs and life course stages that we are mapping and show the diversity of how person-centered criteria are operationalized in practice. For example, the Bolsa Familia uses nutritional stages and child development indicators alongside income as an example of more person-centered criteria, as well as in India, there are conditional maternity benefit on antenatal check based on attendance as well as nutritional status as well. So the final slide, please. So that's a bit of an overview of the things we are doing for using such an intergenerational and person-centered approach. We also have an upcoming bulletin theme issue in the WHO bulletin, which I just wanted to mention, and I can add we can send around the link after the webinar as well, if there's anyone interested in submitting a paper for that. So I will wrap up here. So thank you very much. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to you both for what a great way to kick it off and a fabulous first presentation. Thank you so much. We are now going to move on to hear from Adrian Hayter. So we're going to hear from Adrian, someone with direct experience of how demographic change plays out in communities on the ground. Adrian Hayter brings insight from community and primary care practice, including from Singapore and wider international contexts, examining the gap between system design and lived experience. Professor Adrian Hayter is a GP with nearly 30 years experience and a national leader in older people's care. He has held several senior roles, one within the NHS England, but also including National Clinical Director for Older People, and he now serves as Medical Director for Clinical Policy at the Royal College of General Practitioners, and supports a network of around 200 GPs who support clinical policy across the life course. As medical director, he is responsible for supporting the clinical priority for the college, which is preventative medicine. So with great thanks, Adrian, for being here. And I'm now going to pass over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Emily and Charlotte. And it's lovely to be here and to be with you in this webinar. And how great that introduction, really, in terms of, from the WHO, thinking about the life course approach. And, for me as a general practitioner who works with people from cradle to grave in the NHS, I think we can resonate with that life course approach that was so well articulated there. I wanted to bring kind of in this webinar, kind of from policy right down to practice, if you like, by thinking about what's happening in England, in the NHS, but also to reference some work in Singapore as well. And it all fits within a context of the WHO and us living within the decade of healthy aging as described by the WHO. So I've only got one slide, so if I can pop that slide up, and I will navigate us around the world from Windsor to Singapore. The first thing I actually wanted to kind of just highlight is that we talk about primary care a lot. But for me, primary care is around thinking about the resources that we've got within each of our communities and how important those resources are. And the WHO defined that in 1972 in the Alma Ata as being able to improve healthcare by living within the resources that are allocated to us. And that's not only just the financial resources, it's the resources of people within communities, which is so important. So within that context of primary care, I think it's really important to notice that general practice isn't the only player. And I think it's about our communities and it's about our healthcare delivery, but it's also about those social determinants of health and about our relationships within those communities, which makes a real difference to people's outcomes. And in terms of that, we looking at kind of healthy life expectancy. And the NHS has kind of thought about healthy life expectancy right really from the inception. There was one of the important members of the Lords was a guy called Lord Mullary, who really talked about, he was the first person to talk about healthy life expectancy, and he talked about adding life to years rather than just thinking about mortality. So disappointingly, in England, we have seen that kind of drop in healthy life expectancy, and that's most recently in terms of our most recent surveys. But also, it's seen our kind of healthy life expectancy drop down the table of countries, and you can see in the centre there that the Health Foundation have published a report recently on healthy life expectancy due to this drop in England, and it shows there Japan at the top and really the UK and the USA right at the bottom of that table of healthy life expectancy. A real challenge, isn't it? Because we not only want to be living longer, but we want to be living good years of healthy life. So for me, it's really kind of bearing that in mind, thinking about what policies we have to be able to deliver some of this work. And it crosses those kind of generations and that generational approach that was described within the life course approach. And in my work in the college, we are interested in clinical policy and bringing together all of the different policies that that are coming together to improve people's health outcomes. But there's also general policy, which is so important. And I think we talked about in the last speaker talked about the women's health strategy, and we've just had a launch of in UK the women's health strategy for England. And unfortunately, there was no mention of intergenerational activity, unfortunately, in that report. However, the report described some of the work around the neighbourhood working that is so important, and that this has become part of the NHS and how we're going to be working at smaller than place level in specific neighbourhoods. And I think this is really where the policy action is going to help and support some of the activity that may be of benefit. I'm going to take us to general practice now. And as a GP who works at the Runnymede Medical Practice within a small population around Windsor, I've been interested in not only in the medicines and the development of medicines that have helped improve people's lives over the years, but also in the communities around which kind of support that. And it's the access to leisure services, it's the ability for people to have and be able to live in green space and be able to have wider lives than just kind of those medical interventions. And so really kind of the neighborhood model helps bring some of that together. And I think within general practice, we have been used to that shift over the last few years, bringing social prescribing into every single practice across the country in England and working with those social prescribers to be able to support some of the needs, the wider needs of communities, the community that I work in Old Windsor, but also the communities around in our neighbourhood around the Windsor town. So for me, bringing that policy into practice, thinking about neighbourhoods is really important, and thinking about neighbourhoods in the context of the resources that we've got in those neighbourhoods to be able to make a difference. And I wanted to reference actually some work that went on in COVID, which was some work in a neighbouring place called Slough, where actually what happened was that we started to shift to think about not only the GP practice and people coming to the GP practice, but how can we reach out and reduce some of those health inequalities to people by reaching into people's homes. So instead of just thinking about vaccination for people coming to the practice, we thought about vaccination in terms of the whole household and delivering those vaccinations within the whole household. And not only the vaccinations, but thinking about what interventions in terms of health promotion we can do to be able to support people in their own homes. So that might be the grandmother who hasn't received her flu jab or her RSV vaccine. It might include the mother who hasn't had her cervical smear. It might include the children who might need some interventions around childhood vaccines, for example. So actually thinking about the whole generation who are living in that household, often living together in that multi-generational household. It started to skew the way of working towards delivering towards that particular household and community. And really the opportunities for prevention are really up in foremost in our minds, because we really want to prevent illness and prevent disease to be able to enable us to live those healthy years of life expectancy. So when I came to the college, one of the roles that the medical director for clinical policy has is to really kind of gather up the evidence around what things aren't we doing that we should be doing more of in general practice. And I think we've lost some of that preventive medicine that we were taught in medical school and in general practice training around thinking about supporting people in their self-care, but also the health promotion activity, because we're dealing with on-the-day care and immediate problems all the time. So bringing that back, we've created this preventive medicine policy, which is the gap which we see we should be intervening in, and really thinking much more around primary, secondary and tertiary prevention. We're doing those things, but really kind of enhancing that and making it to come together. So within that policy, I think we're going to be publishing a paper soon, which will hopefully be able to articulate some of the asks that we have of government and other places to be able to deliver a much more preventive, or go back to a much more preventive medicine approach. Coming back to the decade of healthy aging, it's really important that we think about ageism. And ageism is something that occurs, and ageism is something that can be combated. We can make sure that we think about it in this decade of healthy aging and take action. And that's not only just policy and law and thinking about kind of legislation, but it's also about thinking about education and intergenerational interventions. And that's really important part of the decade of healthy aging is what are those interventions that will make a difference? The intergenerational music making that Charlotte and others have been so involved in, all these activities which will then start to combat ageism. But as well as that, in the decade of healthy aging, on the other side of the slide, you can see the combating aging on my left-hand side, I suppose. You can see the WHO Decade of Healthy Aging and the ICOPE program. And this program is really about equipping people to be able to live healthy lives themselves, to know the things that affect their intrinsic capacity, their ability to be able to age in a better way than they're aging at the moment. It's paying attention to their eyesight, the hearing, thinking about activity, thinking about nutrition, thinking about the energy that you expend, thinking about your psychological capacity, and thinking about your mental health capacity. So really some of these things within the ICOPE program, a program which has gone across the world, and where in Singapore we've been kind of promoting it in the region, across the region, as a way of building that resilience within communities for people to age more healthily. And I wanted, as I'd mentioned Singapore, to just mention one of those interventions around intergenerational activity, which the Singapore University of Social Science have actually come out with and also are promoting, which is a very simple game, which is just around intergenerational activity. It's and I carry one in my rucksack. It's a game which can be kept in a small package with various pictures and slides, and it's called Come Let's Chat. It's a way of just starting a conversation between two generations, being able to think about reminiscing, thinking about the place, and be able to start a conversation and a communication between generations. A simple idea, but is going through the region. It's been evaluated around that intergenerational activity that's going to support combating ageism, but also be part of the ICOPE program. So for me, really kind of from policy down to primary care, down to prevention, down to action, these are the things that really kind of excite me. And to be able to support some of this work, especially around kind of the policy making in terms of intergenerational activity, is something we all should be doing in this decade of healthy aging. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Adrian, for a fabulous presentation there. Thank you so much, touching on the neighbourhood model, very much linking practice and policy, touching on the data. And we went from Slough to Singapore. Fabulous. Wonderful. Thank you very much, and some great examples there. We're now going to move on to data. Some data with David. David Sinclair, we are thrilled to have David join us here today. He has spent 20 years in policy and research on ageing and demographic change. He is a recognised authority figure on longevity trends, the economics of an ageing population, and what those shifts mean across health, housing, transport, and technology. He has presented on these themes from Seoul to Singapore, Sydney to Stormont, and serves as international advisor for Sao Paulo Centre on Ageing at Hong Kong University. So with kind thanks, David, and over to you.
Hi, thank you very much for having you, and great to be here. So for those of you who don't know, the International Longevity Centre are an organisation that is life course based and interested in how we can all have healthy, happy, long lives. I've worked, it's interesting with your last point, I've worked in this space for probably over 20 years now. And one of the interesting things which I often tell people is that when I first started working in this area, older people used to say I was too young to work in ageing, and they don't really do that anymore. It's a really complicated area, an area where we have to better understand relationships and their impact. For example, decisions on housing are made by families, not just by older people. Same with savings, same with health. And there's a a fascinating video. It's on YouTube still, I think, called the Thai Smoking Kid, which was an initiative where led by a PR campaign. And what they did is they got a group of kids to go into the markets and ask adults in their 30s to their 80s to ask for a cigarette. And pretty much everyone said no. And this was a prompt for the kid to give a leaflet to the adult to say, please don't smoke. And the PR company agency claims this worked and there was a huge fall in smoking, but actually I suspect it's a little bit tenuous to claim, and the falls in smoking came as a result of higher taxes rather than kids giving adults a leaflet. But there's something interesting in this around sort of how intergenerationally we sort of relations impact on how we live our lives. And Dr. Hayter talked about vaccination. We did a really interesting project a few years ago that was testing whether or not you can use younger people and older people to convince each other to focus on and improve their own health. So, for example, there is an assumption that older people who remember the iron lung and polio might convince younger to take their vaccines. And we did a really interesting project where we brought younger and older people together and to test the thesis. And one of the really interesting things, after 1 million engagements on social media and £50,000 worth of Facebook ads, we did work out that you could engage older people through social media, but we didn't get to a convincing finding that younger people can convince older people or older people can convince younger people. So there remains some research gaps. This is also a really interesting area where actually people are looking for conflict, and I think this is a really important point from public policy. Before Newsnight had its rebrand, we had a couple of times where researchers came to us and asked if we talk about why older people, weren't really stealing all the resources from younger, and they would typically have a journalist or a politician arguing for a rebalancing of spending. We did never get on, and that might have been because they didn't want me, but actually the feedback was typically that they didn't like our answer. They wanted one person to argue older people have had it good and another person to argue that young people were the fortunate generation, and they wanted an angry argument. They wanted heat, not light. And actually me saying it's more complicated than that just didn't sit well. Yes, we need to recognize there is a conflict for resources sometimes, and that policy might not work for all ages. But, older people, for example, and I often debate this with the WHO, I don't believe older people want age-friendly communities. They want older persons-friendly communities. And I think there's a really important distinction that we sometimes ignore. Having said all that, I think some of the framing we have is flawed. Intergenerational fairness isn't about young versus old. It's about whether the systems we rely on work for us all. I don't really need to talk to you about the numbers, so I won't in terms of population growth, but clearly we are already living much longer than in the past, and we are living in an older society in the UK. And as a result, we need to think about how we adapt our systems for that so that they work still for younger and older. We did some work last year on the nighttime economy, which showed that, which was about looking at how towns and cities can adapt more to older people at night. And this was partly about protecting spaces for younger people, but also how do you make the nighttime economy work for older? So it absolutely wasn't about young versus old, but it was about recognizing that unless we adapt our towns and cities at night, they won't serve either younger people or older people. And of course, we're seeing this with the closure of clubs and bars and working men clubs and the sort of things that both younger and older people want. So the solutions have to tie in bringing generations together, not separating them. We, I suppose, highlight our commitment to all ages. Our UK Better Lives Index looks beyond narrow economic measures and attempts to highlight the best places to be born, grow up and grow old. So we have measures of child poverty, measures that take account of housing, life expectancy and healthy life expectancy. So we're interested and clearly want to drive improvements that work for all ages. And as Dr. Hayter has highlighted, healthy aging is driven from earlier investment, taking a long-term cross-government approach with a focus on prevention, good work, resilient and strong communities. Clearly, there is a financial challenge, a financial burden, you could argue. There's certainly rising costs in pensions and health and care that come from aging. But at the same time, we do continue to contribute as we age, whether that be through work, tax, spending, volunteering, and caring. And it's really clear to me that it's imperative that we drive economic growth for younger people to create jobs. And in order to do that, we need to get older people to spend. Yeah, if people over 40 are sitting on 94% of wealth, we need to make sure they're spending and using that money well. If they're not, we don't create jobs for younger people. And there is an economic opportunity here. China sees 10% of its economy within a decade driven by the silver economy. And so younger people need, not keen on the language, but need the silver economy to thrive in order for them to thrive. So great to have WHO here. We absolutely need a life cycle approach to policy and is part of the solution. So I won't re-push that argument. So perhaps just to finish, I think, and I'm really reiterating the point I made a moment ago, intergenerational fairness isn't really about choosing between generations. It's about redesigning systems for longer lives, whether that's thinking about how vaccination works for us across our life course, whether it's thinking about how we redesign our towns and cities so younger and older people want to go out, whether it's about how you get 18-year-olds to do park run as well as 50-year-olds. We've got to think about how we redesign places so they do work for all ages. And the real test for me in this space is how do we get systems in the UK and across the world to work not just for us today, but through our lives. So at that point, I am going to stop, but thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David, and thank you for your insights and contributions from the Better Lives Index, the economic implications of ageing populations, why intergenerational thinking is a strategic necessity, and very much thinking around and saying, the need really to how we can redesign systems for longer lives. So thank you so much for that. We're now going to move on to Jake. We're turning to belonging, identity, and what holds communities together. We're thrilled to have Jake Puddle. He is the Director of Research with us today. He led the State of Us report, a UK-wide study on community cohesion in the aftermath of the 2024 far-right riots, and has authored research on how sport, history and volunteering build connections across difference. So we're thrilled to have you here, Jake, and thank you for presenting.
Thank you, Charlotte, and great to be here with all of you today. So I work for, as was touched on, a think tank called British Future. We are a non-partisan and independent think tank, and we work on trying to sort of take down the temperature of some of the most divisive issues in the UK, essentially in the long run to build a more kind of fair and welcoming society that feels inclusive for all. And hopefully over the next few minutes, I'm going to be exploring some of the findings from our research and what this tells us about the kind of levels of division between our different age groups here in the UK. But also I want to try and dig into some of the opportunities about how we might heal these divides and open up more community connection across our generation, sort of building on some of the great points that David also touched on in his section. Next slide, please. And today, just for a quick bit of background, I'm going to be drawing on the findings of a major study that we conducted last year around the UK, which is sort of intentionally in the wake of the 2024 racist riots. And this study was looking to understand the state of community cohesion and strength here in the UK. We did this with our partners at the Belong Network, and it included 8 focus groups, so some detailed qualitative research, including in areas that saw community unrest. It included a large representative survey of people from around the length and breadth of the country. And it also included a detailed stakeholder consultation as well of over 200 organisations that were bringing communities together, including through many actually who contributed that were doing fantastic intergenerational work also. If we could move on to the next slide. So we've got a poll finding here. Oh dear, I think some of the percentages have not come through. That's a shame. But what does this tell us about how we get along together across our different age generations? Well, what we find in our research really is quite a mixed picture. So what you can see on the graph here is that we asked the public to rank the types of division that they were sort of seeing as having the most negative impact on how we get along together here in the UK. And actually, our divisions by age, so divisions between older and younger people, appear quite far down the list. So you might see sort of lower down, I think in 7th place there. When presented with this long list of divisions, only 18% of the public, so about 1 in 6, put generational divides as one of the top 3 kind of most heated divides. But at the same time, once we started to explore the attitudes that are outlined in this graph in more depth, and dig into these public perceptions, it became clearer that while age is not necessarily seen as the leading source of our country's current divisions, it is certainly a major fault line. And this is particularly true in some of our febrile debates on issues of immigration, integration, and identity. So you can see, for example, that at the very top of the graph, the issue by far seemed to be the most divisive in the UK is that of divides between people who have migrated to the UK or refugees and asylum seekers and those who are born in the UK. And within our polling, what was really clearly illustrated is that those who were seeing this as the top divide tended to be sort of over 50, usually over 55. So very, very strongly this group felt that issues of immigration were extremely divisive here in the UK. Meanwhile, younger people tended to be much more confident about migration and our capacity as a society with diversity to live well together. It's also related, I think, to the fact that young people tend to experience and have contact with diversity, people of different ethnic, faith, or migrant backgrounds in their daily lives much more compared with older age groups. So while the public may not think of our society as one on the surface divided by age, how we bring generations together actually plays quite a big role in addressing some of the sharper tensions present today in our society. Because it's through having more conversations really across our age generations that we get to the front line of some of our tensions of polarization about these themes of immigration or race and religion, where we have some of those sharpest sort of polarizations in our attitudes. And potentially here is also where we can start to open up some more constructive space to disagree with one another better and to find shared needs underneath our political positions. So getting back again to what David was saying about where we all want a kind of fair society rather than wanting to kind of look at it through a young versus old sort of British versus immigrant lens. We often heard also, as alongside our polling and our focus groups, how in a world where our social circles and our news feeds can feel more and more like echo chambers, actually family chats at the dinner table between children, parents, and even grandparents could be one of the few spaces where we actually kind of engage and consider one another's perspectives, sometimes in a heated way, but also sometimes in a fair and constructive way too. And actually, what was really interesting was that during our focus groups, we deliberately sought to source people from the local areas that we visited who represented a mix of age groups. And they really welcomed the opportunity to sit down and have a cup of tea and a chat with one another over the course of the research, and often came up to us at the end to shake our hand and say, we need more of this in our society to get into the nitty-gritty of how we live together better in the long run. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. Importantly, another key finding to come out of our research is the extent to which connections, community connections, make a difference to how we feel about our society. So when we asked survey respondents about if they felt community cohesion was going well or not going well in their area, by far the biggest factor was the level of contact that people reported having with others from different backgrounds. And where this was more positive and where this contact was more frequent, individuals reported being much more confident in the state of society, the state of divisions in our society, feeling that these weren't kind of the be-all and end-all, or that, we were heading towards a civil war or inevitable conflict. And this, in fact, supports a very large body of evidence stretching over decades, which finds that one of the best antidotes to division and polarization is social contact. So the more we meet and mix with one another up close, the more we tend to form bonds of trust with one another, we can empathize with one another's different life experiences, and we can find shared identities, shared sense of belonging, as well as kind of recognizing one another's differences. And relating this back to the intergenerational theme of today's event, again, starting with contact between our age groups can be a really great starting point for trying to open up more of these community connections. Because as I noted earlier on, it often tends to be older generations who are more anxious about our changing society and who have less of this direct interaction with people of different faiths, ethnicities, and cultures. And meanwhile, younger people are a more diverse generation and are more at ease and confident with this diversity as well. So actually you can achieve kind of intersectional aims of tackling ageism and tackling racism and xenophobia as well through opening up connections that are both intergenerational and cross-community. So if we could go to the next slide, please. What's more, what we also find as well in our research is that there are some kind of more structural barriers that we need to get into as well, before we can kind of establish new connections in society. I know David touched on this a little bit, so I won't go into too much detail. One of the things we are seeing in society is that community spaces are fewer and often lower quality than they used to be in perhaps previous generations. And we know that this is having a bit of a corrosive effect on the capacity for people of different ages and backgrounds to come together. We also know that about half of society reports not having enough money to participate in community life, which can be a big financial obstacle to kind of putting in place those connections, as I say, that can have such an impactful and effective make the key difference really to bringing down the heat of our divisions. And lastly as well, about a third of society, particularly among younger people and those with caring responsibilities, are time poor. So again, when thinking about some of the community connection solutions that I'll get onto in the following slides, we need to bear these key obstacles in mind to make sure that some of the work that we do put in place through our public policy, through our civil society interventions, acknowledge these barriers, both in terms of money, access to community spaces, the need for more of those, but also to make sure that they are inclusive and kind of flexible enough to welcome in people who might have caring responsibilities, might be working multiple jobs, and so might struggle to engage in community life. But if we could move on to the next slide, what I want to do with the rest of the time really is just kind of outline at a very kind of brief level how we might go about building some of this community connection and strengthen community cohesion along lines of generational divides as well as other divides too. Now, firstly and foremost, it's really important to get this right that we address the scale of division in real time through government action. Now here, we've actually seen some positive improvements since our research was published. So for the first time, at least in England, we now have a national cohesion strategy, which is ensuring that more funding goes into community projects that bring people together. And that also is trying to kind of establish building blocks and kind of cross-government working to give clearer long-term focus at a national level to community cohesion. We also have something called the Pride in Place Fund, which is £6 billion delivered over 10 years, and that's supporting many of the most disconnected and deprived areas of the UK with pots of money to address local issues that matter to them. And interestingly, from a kind of intergenerational lens, it's letting people in those communities decide how that money is spent by bringing those communities together along lines of different generations and different sort of ethnicities and social classes as well, to work together on sort of common causes that matter in those places. So both of these policies will be really important to getting more activities up and running that can promote that really important social connection in the areas where it's lacking the most. We saw that in our research, how much that really mattered to the areas that saw riots, for example, because they just felt they had a lack of agency to deliver meaningful change in areas that had seen, worn down high streets and stretched public services. At the same time that this government action is coming into place, though, I should be really clear that we at British Future see it as a crucial first step towards a longer journey. So it's important that we get a plan in place for delivering on community connection and addressing threats to social cohesion. But we also want to see this built upon further. So namely, we want to see the government step up to address risks of online misinformation, where we know that both older and younger groups can be vulnerable in different ways to conspiracy content, mis, dis, and malinformation. We want to see more investment in integration in communities for new migrants, which can help to reassure some of those older age groups who are worried about immigration and its impact on society, as we saw in the first slide. And we also want to make integration easier for new arrivals as well by kind of reducing some of the settlement periods required to attain indefinite leave to remain and citizenship. So government is doing some positive work, and we're seeing, more strategic action, but it's unfinished progress with longer strategic investment needed to build the really important foundations. If we could move on to the final couple of slides, though. It's not all about policymakers. I think that's the key message I want to sort of provide today. In fact, there are many ways that institutions, large and small, and even individuals, many of us here today, there are many ways we can get involved in driving change to bring us closer together as a society, including across our ages. So as I touched on earlier, social contact across our generations and our different backgrounds offers one of the most well-proven routes in social science to diffusing our divides and strengthening a shared sense of belonging and cohesion. And outside kind of the choppy world of politics, this can actually be a responsibility on all of us, really, to think about where we can actively facilitate those connections in our workplaces, in our neighbourhoods, and in our community institutions. And in fact, our findings consistently show from our research that there are a rich array of kind of spheres in our culture in Britain that can really successfully unite us across our ages and our political divides too. And so just to finish up, I'm going to outline some of these, and it would be great to kind of get you all to sort of go away and think about how you might be able to think about building in community connection to some of the great work that I'm sure you're all doing in some of these different spheres. So firstly, looking at the slide, we have culture. So thinking both about sport and the creative arts. Our polling at British Future shows that a majority of people in the UK across ages have a creative hobby, and 6 in 10 of us support a football club, for example. So sport and arts can both be a really important social glue, where we might already have kind of institutions in communities like football clubs or like arts and culture institutions that are doing great work, but perhaps doing it in silos, reaching young people through one intervention and older people over 65 through another. So sport and arts can be a fantastic route into conversations that essentially bring us together to keep our hands busy or get us having a kickabout, but which can then also kind of organically open up conversations about our different life experiences, our different lived experiences, and our different political views. And I know the work of Charlotte and Intergenerational England with the Intergenerational Music Making initiative is a fantastic case study into how sports and culture can be really important sort of forces for unity and common ground that we can build upon. So again, this is a fantastic route in. Volunteering is another really excellent route to fostering community connection, and one in which I think almost every part of the UK can claim to have a kind of volunteer infrastructure, VCS organisation or kind of network in place that could be built upon to strengthen intergenerationals and cross-community connections. So we also picked up on this throughout our research, that one of the kind of most positive success stories for community cohesion people could draw upon in their kind of collective memory was the COVID-19 kind of silver lining, I suppose, of that volunteer army that emerged through mutual aid groups, through these new WhatsApp groups that popped up to help deliver prescriptions to young people, to help protect and shield those most vulnerable in society. So where volunteering organisations and networks can actively be seeking to work across communities, engaging younger people in volunteering for the first time and bringing them into contact with older, more established volunteers, we know this can also be another route into strengthening community connections. Thirdly, I want to throw in deliberative decision making. I think, again, this comes back to some of the points David made in his previous contribution, but where actually generations might hold different positions on themes like immigration or diversity, actually, a lot of the time, some of their needs, their underlying needs, might be the same. For example, wanting a proud and thriving sort of sense of belonging, or a community high street, wanting kind of dignified public services that treat people with respect and are person-centered. So actually building in kind of decision-making processes like co-production or community kind of deliberative discussions and dialogue exercises. These can be fantastic ways of opening up conversations in a more constructive space away from our online sphere, but more kind of rooted at a local level, to encourage respectful disagreement between people of different ages and backgrounds, as well as the discovery of more common ground and a sense of, having common needs and wanting a common direction in politics and in our society. And just lastly, I'll finish up by saying history can be a really, really fantastic route into also opening up kind of shared belonging and a sense of sort of inclusive shared identity in the UK as well. So we saw how history can be divisive, particularly in 2020 during some of the Black Lives Matter protests, and how that led to quite a fractious debate across our generations about themes like colonialism. But interestingly, at British Future, something that I can share around after this session, is that we've used history as a route to strengthen common ground across age groups as well, particularly, for example, through looking at themes and traditions like Remembrance Day, that are something that we all mark in the UK. What we've done is set up a new initiative called the Remember Together campaign, which looks at the Commonwealth contribution of people across different Caribbean and South Asian backgrounds, across different faiths, and their contribution in both the First and Second World Wars, and how actually remembrance can be something that is reflective of the diverse and multi-ethnic society that we share in the UK today, and that can feel relevant to people of all ages and backgrounds, as well as those who kind of lived through the World Wars or recall talking about it with their parents growing up. So these are just a few, I think, examples of how we can foster social connection as institutions and individuals to supplement some of the important work that needs to be done by government. I'm aware I'm a little bit over time, so I'll hand back to the others now, but happy to dig into this more afterwards, and my email is on the final slide there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jake. And thank you so much for sharing the research, but also touching on some really great examples there. Fabulous. And we very much look forward to seeing how the National Cohesion Strategy, and particularly the Pride in Place, and how that develops. So thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. We're now going to move on to introduce Natalie. Natalie Raben is a doctoral researcher in public space studies at Manchester Met University, using Barcelona as a living urban laboratory to study how design, management, and everyday spatial conditions shape where the generations actually interact. Before academia, Natalie held senior leadership roles in New York and London, delivering public realm strategy and large-scale community events. So we're thrilled that Natalie is here today. Thank you so much, Natalie, and I shall pass over to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, and it's so great to be in this amazing panel of great minds. Also, I'm going to be talking about stuff that a lot of people have already touched on already, intergenerational communications at the neighborhood level and how important that is. My research, which I'm about halfway through, is looking at intergenerational interactions in Barcelona's public spaces. So you can move on to the next slide. So I am doing this because also, as many people have brought up already, population demographics are changing, and we're looking at an aging population. And I believe the statistics are that in 2022, the over 65 cohort has 10% of the population, and that's going to increase to, I think, 16% of the population by 2050 globally. In Barcelona, the over 65 cohort already has 21% of the population. So it's kind of a good opportunity to kind of use this as a case study to look at when you have this kind of larger portion of the population being of this elderly cohort, how are people sharing the public spaces together, and what are the actual dynamics? Because as has been brought up already before, the communications between generations is so important. And what I'm looking at is on the ground, what's actually happening in real time in public spaces. So you can move on to the next slide. So I am about halfway through 3 years of my PhD research, and I have an ethnographic approach to the research. So I am doing behavioral mapping, stakeholder interviews, and intercept interviews. And I've chosen 3 different public space types in Barcelona. They're all a bit different from each other, so I can kind of be representative of different things happening in different places. So I have Joan Moreau Park, which is a large park that's separated into different zones. Then I have Consell de Cent, which is part of a brand new urban intervention called Superblocks in Barcelona, where they're creating semi-pedestrianized streets where priority is given to cyclists and pedestrians instead of vehicles. And then I also have Plaza de la Iglesia, which is located in a suburb of Barcelona. So the population demographic dynamics are quite different. It's 70,000 people as opposed to central Barcelona, which is 1.7 million people. So in each of these spaces over a 1-year period, I'm going to spend 120 hours sitting, making observations, making maps, connecting all of that, and then quantifying what I am seeing into different interaction episodes. You can move on to the next slide. So I'm halfway through this so far, and I've begun to do some preliminary analysis. So when I say I'm breaking it down into interaction episodes, it doesn't have to be interactions between people, but it can be interactions between people and the environment, interactions between people and their devices, because I'm trying to get a full picture of what's kind of going on in any space at any given time to kind of represent all of the interaction-based activity. And so far with this very preliminary data analysis, I am coming up with 3 different themes that are keep on being repeated in my spaces. So the first and strongest is that dogs are acting as generational social connectors. The next being less complicated places, acting as more social spaces. And the reality that I'm sure doesn't come as a surprise to all of us, that not all intergenerational presence is leading to interaction. So now we're going to go through the different themes, and I'll give you sort of anecdotes for the different themes that sort of illustrate how these themes are coming to life. So the first and strongest theme is dogs acting as social connectors. So I am not a dog person, and I did not start this research aiming to, study dogs. And, I have lots of respect for dog people. It's not my thing, but here we are. And so I noticed that the dogs were creating a lot of communications between people, and I found this to be quite interesting. So I found this to be most prevalent in Joan Moreau Park, which I said is like a large sort of traditional park. And within the park, there's zones, and one of which is a dog area. But I didn't realize it was a designated dog area until after several visits, because it's not enclosed and it's not bisected. It's centrally located in the middle of the park. So it's completely integrated, and it's a part of the park that it's completely realistic and reasonable for other people to use as well. And it doesn't really have borders. It has perimeter seating. So I noticed this kind of big morning cohort in Joan Moreau Park. And I thought it was quite interesting that they seem to be more than just friends. They seem to know each other quite well. And really quickly, before I go into the anecdote, I'll explain the statistics of what I've seen. So in Joan Moreau Park, according to the kind of analysis, the preliminary analysis that I've done, I see 40% of all interactions being mediated by dogs, whereas in the other locations that are more kind of like open plan plazas, that goes down to 9 and 11% respectively. So in Jonah Park in the mornings, I was noticing this really kind of enthusiastic cluster. And in my data, I was also seeing that 70% of interactions were mediated by dogs in the morning. So I actually ended up speaking to one of these people, and I came to find that what started as kind of superficial dog-based relationships grew into this multi-generational friend group. There's about 10 to 12 of them, and they span ages from 30s to 70s. And their dogs have brought them together, but then they've taken that to the next level, and they have coffees together after the dog meetings. They go out, they do doggy daycare together, they travel together, they share major life events together. And I found it to be so interesting that they would have never come across each other if it wasn't for the design of the space, if it wasn't for the agency of the dogs bringing them together. And I thought there's got to be something here with the potential for these superficial bonds to grow into meaningful relationships as based by dogs kind of sniffing each other out in public spaces. A lot of these people, they're international, they don't have family nearby, so this has become their urban family. So this is the thread that I'm kind of following the strongest in the research. We can move on to the next slide, which is less complicated places acting as more social spaces. So what I mean by this is Conseil de Cent and Plaza de la Iglesia have very open plan formats. And here's an example. So in Conseil de Cent, I was doing 2 subsequent observation windows a couple weeks ago, and it was during the afternoon hours. And I noticed during those 2 hours worth of observations, 18 kids that were passing through on their commute home, instead of just walking through the plaza, they sort of hop, skip, and jumped on these little stones here. So they had a really playful moment in this very, very dense, busy urban environment, because this one is in central Barcelona. And moments like this kind of attract attention from people, give the adults that they're with a kind of moment to pause and rest. And if it wasn't for the design and the architecture, this type of occurrence wouldn't happen. Now, another example in Plaza de la Iglesia, which was quite comical, there was a dad and a kid kicking around a football the other day, and they were in the center of the plaza, and it's enormous. So there's so much space. It's also surrounded by perimeter seating. So there was an elderly woman with her walker trying to cross the plaza, and just so happens, bad timing, but the kid kicked the football and it went right in the direction of the elderly woman. So instead of having a terse or negative reaction, she took her walker and she kicked it right back to him. And then they started having this sort of playful volley back and forth. And this sort of attracted a lot of attention from onlookers. And it was another kind of playful moment where these people were experiencing this moment together. So I'm seeing like the openness of these types of spaces, because it's completely appropriate for so many different types of people to be in there at any given time. There's an increase in age-based generational communications that can happen in this space because there's more opportunities for it. One more quick anecdote. The other day, I spoke to a man, you can go back to their slide, who was sitting on a bench, the perimeter seating, which I will show you towards the end of the slides. And he called himself the chocolate grandpa. Why did he call himself the chocolate grandpa? So I was doing an Intercept interview with him, and what he explained to me is he comes out to the plaza in between meal time, so in between breakfast and lunch, and then in between lunch and dinner, because he says he has grandkids that are grown and they don't live nearby. So he comes there because it's the life, it's the energy, it's the kids, all of his friends he's made from sitting on the benches there. So he has this whole cohort of elderly friends, but he is known to the kids in the neighborhood as the chocolate grandpa because he gives, with permission from their parents, he gives them chocolate. And he says some of his friends from the benches, people approach them for chocolate because maybe they look enough alike that the kids might confuse them, but he's created kind of this, he's this like neighborhood archetype and this neighborhood character, all because of the design of the space lends itself to him having a comfortable place and being part of the energy and the action. So now we can move on to the next slide. So this is the reality that not intergenerational presence is leading to interaction. So I have, quantified the different interactions that I'm seeing. And like I mentioned, some are solitary, passive, or non-engagement. So out of all of what I've been seeing, nearly half of my interactions are people not actually interacting together, but more individually or with their environment. So I think this leaves a lot of room for possibilities to kind of create spaces where more actual interaction amongst people are encouraged. And further broken down, I have so far 24% of my interactions that I've seen are intergenerational. And I haven't quite broken it down yet between familial and spontaneous, but that's kind of the next level that I'm going to be going to in my data analysis. So what I'm seeing is that people are sharing spaces, but they're not exactly sharing moments. So, and on the right, you have an example of an elderly woman in her care sitting on a bench with another young lady, opportunities for communication, but it doesn't happen. And on the left, we flip the script. And here was something that I found to be quite nice, because here on one side, we have a playground full of children. And on the other side, we have an elderly exercise class taking place. But this fence in between the two zones acts as a border instead of a boundary. And here we have a mother hoisting up her little kid to kind of, watch and experience the elderly exercise class, while the people from the class use the fence as storage for their belongings. So this is a shared negotiated space where there is intergenerational exchange. You can move on to the next slide. And so I'm still knee deep in observations and analysis, but my preliminary conclusions are suggesting that intergenerational interactions in public space happen when specific spatial, social, and routine conditions are present. And I'm sure a lot of people on here kind of work in this field, with public spaces. So a lot of what I'm seeing, it's nothing so new and so novel, but it is intentional. And, as I continue with the research, I'll be able to kind of decode more exactly what those things are. But at the moment, the biggest takeaways are that the role I'm seeing architecture play is these open environments being opportunities where more communication can be encouraged, and the importance of using, the agent as the dog, something like a third thing for people to kind of bond over or talk about as a way to encourage communication. So thank you all very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Natalie. Fabulous presentation. Thank you for sharing your thoughts around the difference really between co-presence and meaningful connection, and for highlighting your research. It's fascinating, and I'm sure there will be some questions. On that note, I am aware of time, so people are able to put questions into the chat. And we will try and get them at the end. We might run a few minutes over, but please do pop your questions in the chat. I'd now like to introduce Ingrid. Ingrid is a research consultant for Intergenerational England, and we're thrilled that Ingrid will be sharing the findings from our new report, including the global evidence base for intergenerational approaches, what good system design looks like in practice, and referencing our sliding scale framework for thinking about intergenerationality across sectors. So Ingrid, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Charlotte. Next slide, please. So as Charlotte said, we have launched a new report this week. So I encourage you to read it. It's very readable. It's very interesting. There are lots of examples and also some practical tips as well as analysis in there. It's called Past, Present and Future Generations, International Perspectives on Intergenerational Policy and Practice. It's a bit of a mouthful for me. And we're very grateful for the support of the University of Southampton for this report. And we wanted with this report to fill two specific gaps in our knowledge. The first one is we have increasing volumes of evidence on the effectiveness of intergenerational practice when it comes to interventions, discrete interventions that happen at a small scale at project level. So that evidence is growing. and is very valuable, but we have far less evidence about what good intergenerational policy making or intergenerational systems look like. And we wanted to draw out examples around the world because we know they exist and they're happening and being tested. So that's one thing we wanted to do. The second thing we wanted to do is provide some conceptual clarity around the concepts related to generational thinking. Generational thinking, as you'll see in a second, is pervasive in policy fields, and we've seen that today as well. But actually, the way people use the term intergenerational is different. And so there's a risk that we might be talking at cross purposes, we might be talking about different things when we use that word, or we might not recognize intergenerationality because we're using a different term. So I'll just move on to the, Emily, can you move us on to the next slide? And then I'll just explain that first thing that we found. We found that there were three kind of general camps of policy approaches that have developed mainly over the last 40 years, although one is much older than the others. So generational thinking, as you all, I'm sure, know, has been at the heart of how we organize societies for millennia, primarily generations within a family, but more recently, especially with demographic shifts and migration, generations within society. And multi-generational approaches are those approaches that focus on addressing the needs of different age groups, usually in parallel. So that usually means there might be a youth strategy and an older people strategy, or there might be an age-friendly society or something else. But it's usually focusing on one part of the life course independently from others. Now, as you heard from the WHO earlier, where life course approaches are layered on top of multi-generational approaches, then there is intergenerationality often, but it's not guaranteed. There is no particular requirement for multi-generational approaches to connect generations together. The second policy approach is future generations. So future generations have emerged much more recently in the last 15 or 20 years, and they aim to improve outcomes both for young people today, but mainly looking at future generations, at children born today or children born in the future. So they address systemic inequalities, and often they deal with emerging or new global challenges. So, for example, climate change or the role of artificial intelligence in jobs, things that are going to change society, especially for younger generations into the future. Again, there may be some intergenerational connection in these policies and these approaches, but it's not guaranteed. Intergenerational approaches recognize the interdependence between generations, and they embed connection and reciprocity and shared responsibility between generations across systems so that we can improve outcomes now and in the future. So intergenerationality is very much about bringing generations together, aiming to improve well-being and social connection and cohesion and solidarity, and challenging age stereotypes. The little diagram is supposed to show that there are very few of these policies are purely one thing. They often include ingredients from the other policy types, but I think it's important for us to know the different terminology. Next slide. And so the characteristics of intergenerational approaches, which are the ones we're particularly interested in, are interconnection. So the idea that decisions that in one cohort affect opportunities and outcomes in another. So even if you're working in a silo that just looks at youth or just looks at aging, decisions you take for that cohort affect the rest of society. That's an important aspect of intergenerational design. Mutuality, reciprocal benefit, and collective value. So it's not about one generation benefiting from others, but all generations benefiting, especially from connecting with each other. And then this idea that this needs to be structural. We need to embed intergenerational thinking across all areas of policy, governance, commissioning, and evaluation and research, and treat intergenerationality as a public good. Next. So one of the things we did is we looked across the world and found case studies that explained intergenerational policymaking, but also some intergenerational practice where it had been scaled or where it was likely to be rolled out. And we found case studies from around 13 countries. So I'm not going to go through all of them at all. So I'll just go to the next slide. And just a couple of examples, we looked at South Sudan, where a storytelling project was being rolled out to train young women to interview and record older women's stories and songs and memories. And this, I'm including this, even though it's much more of at a practitioner level at this stage, because it really addresses some very large structural issues in society related to migration patterns associated with war and climate change. So intergenerational approaches can start to heal some of those very big ruptures that are happening in some places in the world. I think Sierra Leone was mentioned, so I won't look at that again. But then in Portugal, I wanted to pick out the fact that shared living programs, which are now actually very popular around the world, in many places in the world, which match older people, usually living on their own, with a student or a younger person who needs cheap accommodation and somewhere to call home. And it's for mutual benefit. And the reason that I have this in here is because it's been going for 20 years now. So we have a lot of evidence about this. It's been rolled out quite widely. We need to think about this now as something that we embed across other sectors as well. Next. And so one of the things we wanted to say is, okay, so we have lots of examples, we have some conceptual clarity, but how do we do it? And one of the things that Intergenerational England is doing is bringing together tools to do a number of things. The first one is a diagnostic tool, which basically allows organizations and systems to think, how intergenerational am I? How intergenerational are we, and how intergenerational can we be if we tweaked a few things about how we work, if we break down some silos, if we joined up some budgets, if we trained staff together in core skills. So this is our intergenerational maturity framework, and we hope it can provide some guidance on developing intergenerational capacity for organizations. And the other thing is, we need to know, how do we know it worked? And one thing that's becoming very clear is that we need some shared outcomes frameworks and some shared indicators of success across intergenerational policies and systems. And that's something that I know many people on this call are working on, and we are also working on it, and we'd like to test some of those together. Next, please. So there's a lot of momentum, and we know it needs some organization, but we'd like to know what you think. So here is the report. Please download it and have a look and tell us what you think. But also send us any examples that we've missed, because we are building a library of case studies from around the world that shows some examples of what's possible and what needs to be studied further. So send us your examples and get in touch if you'd like to talk to us about your program and to see how we can help.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ingrid, for that. And we will be sharing that link with you all, and also the report post this. Also, in the other slide that you just saw, there is lots of other things going on this week, Global Intergenerational Week. So do get involved. Thank you so much for everybody. I'm aware of the time. We have got a few minutes. It's just at the most incredible panel, in wonderful experts, and all presentations were absolutely fantastic and so eloquently delivered. So thank you so much. Emily's controlling the Q&As. So if there are any Q&As, Emily, please do, any questions, do let us know. Are there any urgent ones?
So one from Christopher says, could universities and say the University of Third Age do more to help here? Christopher's about to start a U3A group in Edinburgh called After Success, What Next, to encourage people to repivot as they approach retirement. I don't know whether anyone has any thoughts on the role of universities in this kind of broader intergenerational ecosystem. Any of our... Go, Adrian.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's interesting actually, because we think about universities kind of being for particular groups of people, but actually in Singapore, one of the things that they've been doing is actually a lot of people have two careers, and they will then go on to learn. So the Singapore University of Social Science has a lot of what we would call mature students who come, and actually then there is that kind of intergenerational kind of activity. It's not an answer to the university of the third age necessarily, but it's interesting. Our concepts around universities actually need to change as well, and around careers, linking that to careers as well, because Singapore University of Social Science kind of creates the opportunities for more social science careers, if you like, for people to be able to develop as part of an extension of their career, not only in one area, but kind of leading into another.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Jake, did you want to come in there?
Just on a slightly adjacent point, I mean, we've been doing a lot of research on how we can open up more community spaces in the UK, including a deep dive in Newham in East London recently, where they've got lots of new universities setting up. They've got the University of East London that's been there a long time, a new UCL campus, a new University of the Arts London campus. And actually, I think universities can have a really simple offer, which is just that they have enormous campuses that are often sitting kind of dormant and unused. And particularly awareness of these spaces and you know, the sports activities, the kind of open lectures that are available in them the awareness of that is clustered among younger people. But if there was more kind of community outreach to welcome in people of you know, beyond the campus, beyond the faculty, to use those spaces, that might go some way as a kind of easy fix really to addressing some of the gaps in our community infrastructure in parts of the UK.
Yeah, I think that's a great point as well. Has anyone else got anything to add to that point before I move on to another question? This is probably for Natalie, but Rita says, interesting point about the dogs. Be eager to see how this would translate into some urban areas in the UK where phobia of dogs is an issue in certain communities. Again, it can be broad, but Natalie, I don't know if you want to respond to maybe how sort of translated your evidence is going to be.
Yeah, I think it's obviously going to depend on, you know, I think that in order to be a dog owner, you have to already be in a certain bracket. And I think that I don't know how much it would be able to translate. It depends on like the depth of phobias, I would say, because it's also kind of self-selected. So if you have a phobia of dogs and you see dogs in a public space, probably you won't be approaching them. But you know, if you're with someone who does approach it, you know, that could be sort of like a foot in the door type thing with it. But I think there's actually a lot of studies that have been done on the social health benefits of dogs with the elderly, and a lot of them have actually been done in the UK. I found that to be quite interesting. So my literature is centered around a lot of work that's done in the UK, but I don't know if it would solve phobias, people with phobias for dogs, but it certainly could be a stepping stone.
Yeah, it feels like a whole other research piece that. But I think, as you said there, the dogs it's almost the vehicle, the mechanism to connection, isn't it? And that can look very different across different communities in different countries. So brilliant. I think we're 1 minute over. Apologies that the discussion has not been longer. There was just so much rich content from all of the speakers today. And a huge thank you to everyone who's joined us. A huge thank you to the panel and the presenters. What an incredible insight and expertise shared this afternoon. And for those who have joined us, we will share out some information. If you want us to link you with any of the speakers, I'm sure they'd be more than happy to connect and share their research and more of their incredible thinking. So yes, and please do check out the rest of Global Intergenerational Week. There's lots going on around the world. But I think we'll close it there. So yeah, brilliant. Thank you, and have a brilliant rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.